Spoštovani, v veliko čast in veselje mi je pozdraviti med nami imenitnega gosta, ki je pripotoval k nam iz daljne Rusije, iz Moskve. To je Vladimir Aleksandrovič Plungjan, jezikoslovec, splošni jezikoslovec, ki se ukvarja s tipologijo jezikov, s slovnico, občo slovnico, občo morfologijo, z gramatičnimi kategorijami. S Corpusom je eden od začetnikov, iniciatorjev in vodilnih pri ruskem nacionalnem korpusu. Ampak njegova znanstvena pot se je začela s proučevanjem eksotičnih jezikov. Udeležil se je še kot mlad jezikoslovec, študirajo pod vodstvom profesorja Kibrika iz Moskve, ki je bil predstojnik katedre za teoretično jezikoslovje in je se udeleževal ekspedicij na Kavkaz, je raziskoval kavkaške jezike, o tem pisal, potem pa njegova kandidatska disertacija je pa opis določenih značilnosti afriškega jezika Dogon v državi Mali. To sem se vse poučila v enciklopediji. Tako da je profesor Plungjan začel kot tipološki lingvist s proučevanjem neevropskih jezikov in je tudi priznan afrikanist. Knjigo o jeziku Dogon so mu, poleg tega, da so jo objavili te stvari v Rusiji, so objavili tudi v Nemčiji. Knjigo o jeziku Dogon. Potem njegova doktorska disertacija se je pa že malo umaknila od konkretnih jezikov, ampak je bila že o določenih problemih splošne semantike gramatične. O tem je napisal doktorsko disertacijo. Med njegovimi knjigami sta najbolj znani dve. Obča morfologija, ki je doživela že 2 izdaji, in knjiga Uvod v gramatično semantiko, gramatični pomeni in gramatični sistemi svetovnih jezikov. Ta druga je dobila nagrado za najboljši učbenik v tistem času. Potem je profesor Plungjan tudi napisal popularno knjigo Začem jeziki takije raznije. Ta knjiga je bila napisana za šolarje in je tudi dobila nagrado, je doživela več izdaj in je dobila nagrado za poljudno znanstveno delo. V svojem raziskovanju gramatičnih pomenov se je ukvarjal z različnimi kategorijami, besednimi vrstami, veliko z glagolom. In je vpeljal tudi določene pojme v mednarodno splošno gramatiko, ukvarjal se je zlasti z modalnostjo in z vidom. Lahko povem, da na straneh revije Skandoslavika je že 1 leto med najbolj branimi njegov članek o tipoloških značilnostih slovanskega vida. To, kar se zdi nam nekaj edinstvenega, gleda profesor Plungjan z stališča jezikov sveta in najbrž ni tako edinstveno. Kot zadnje čase se ukvarja zlasti s korpusno lingvistiko, o tem nam bo tudi danes predaval, ker kot rečeno je eden od iniciatorjev in tudi voditeljev dela pri nacionalnem korpusu ruskega jezika. Poleg tega je tudi delal pri vzhodno-armenskem nacionalnem korpusu. Ampak to še ni dosti. Tako raznoliko delovanje je treba dopolniti, beremo njegovo bibliografijo in tam beremo antologijo latinske poezije. Prevedel, sestavil in napisal komentarje Vladimir Aleksandrovič Plungjan. Tako da se tudi zanima za latinsko poezijo in poezijo nasplošno, tudi rusko poezijo. Potem bosta kasneje predavala skupaj z mladim sodelavcem Kirilom Korčaginom. Ampak zdaj najprej vas prosim za vaše predavanje o korpusu. Lepa. Tole bom dala pa okoli tele eno občo morfologijo, to je že druga izdaja. Prvo izdajo imam jaz doma, jaz njo tako uporabljala, da je ne najdem. Ja, to sem pozabila, točno. Seveda. Pravzaprav se moramo malo zahvaliti temu, da imamo profesora Plungjana med nami, tudi temu, da je obiskal Zagreb, kajti tam so že prevedli njegovo občo morfologijo, ki bo izšla jeseni. Tako da ta knjiga je doživela tudi prevod v hrvaški jezik, kar bo tudi nam rusistom je ruska, ampak komu drugemu bo mogoče hrvaška bolj dostopna. Zdaj bi pa jaz bom dala tile dve knjigi naokoli. Med filologi je navada, da se kradejo knjige. Lepo prosim, vrnite nam te knjige.
Well, I'll speak English. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for having invited me. That's true that I came to Zagreb for discussion for my Croatian translation of this book about general morphology and grammatical semantics. But I'm very glad to be here and to present mainly Russian national corpus, and a part of our talk will be about Russian poetry in corpus and outside corpus as well. This will be the second part. And so, a brief introduction into corpus linguistics in general and some more details about Russian national corpus. I think that many of you, maybe the majority of you, are well aware of what corpus linguistics is and how different corpora are structured and organized. Nevertheless, I try to begin with some very basic things and then directly to Russian corpus and corpus linguistics, that's a relatively young branch of linguistics, general and applied linguistics, and in a narrow sense it is just that's about how to make and use electronic corpora, so as a technical sense. But what is more interesting probably for us and for linguistic theory in general, that corpus linguistics can be applied in a wider sense, and that begins more interesting. That's about how a language can be viewed through a corpus, because we always say that a corpus is not just a technical device, that's something more than that, and corpus gives us a new look on language. And so maybe in this second wider sense we can speak about not about corpus linguistics, but about the corpus-based, corpus-oriented linguistics. That's a good one. Anyway, we can say that this corpus-based linguistics is a kind of new theory, new ideology, if you will, which is maybe close to what is usually called functional linguistics and modern linguistic theories, and especially what is called usage-based approach, represented by Langeka, Tomasello, and many others. And here the connections are especially tight, and corpus-based linguistic and usage-based theories usually go hand in hand, sharing many theoretical basic assumptions about language. We'll see how it works. I would like to recall that first corpora appeared as early as 1960s. But these corpora were very strange from modern point of view. They were very small, and their functionality was very poor. and were largely ignored by mainstream linguistic community. Something they were viewed rather like a marginal instrument for example, for statistical status, for some very simple calculations of the frequency of English character in English text. So the first corpora, like Brown corpus, for example, the first corpus created for the United States, something like a toy for applied linguistics, and in fact not very interesting for general linguistics doing theory, because linguistic theory in 1670s went in another direction. So corpora were something very, very marginal for this. And this situation changed maybe since 90s, since early 90s, when what we can call modern corpora appeared. That's where the massive expansion of corpora. And these modern corpora were much bigger. For example, British National Corpus, maybe the first well-known corpus, popular corpus, was just about 100 million. That's not very much from today's view, but it was a big achievement at that time. Now we have Miller-Douglas corpora, that's no one, and even bigger. We have large web corpora, so the size, that's important. And of course, the modern corpora have much more sophisticated functionality. They allow us to ask very different questions about language and to have very interesting answers about this. And we can say that from this time, corpora open to mainstream linguistic research, theoretical linguists, in principle, all linguists realized that they cannot do without corpora, in fact. So that's a relatively recent achievement, and there are still linguists which must be persuaded, but not many obviously, but still maybe some of them. So that's remains actually, but of course, under our modern period, that's the period of corpus linguistics, theoretical linguistics, and corpus linguistics come together. Okay, very briefly, I think that you are very well aware about what is a corpus, but still, just a few words to be on the safe side and tell. So usually we tell that a corpus is an informational system based on a digitalized text collection. And we have to distinguish between corpus and library or digital library, because these are two different notions, because corpus is not just a collection of text. First, we have what we call annotation, special about text, and the whole text are normally not available in a corpus. You cannot read them through like in the library, because corpus is not only for reading, just for using, for getting examples. So that's an important difference. And annotation, then the main property of each corpus. There are so-called tags, which are hidden. They are not visible to a normal user. And these tags are added by designers, by developers to input text. It can be automatic or manual, it depends. And there are special software, usually called search engine, for an automatic retrieval of a relevant example. Search engine is based on annotation, so the richer the annotation, the more powerful possibilities for searching in the corpora. But in order to be good, the corpus must be previously annotated, and it can be a very time-consuming thing. So, for example, I'll give you just a fragment from Russian National Corpus, how it looks. These are tags which are normally not visible to the users, but in principle, that's not a plain Russian text, you see. This strange mixture of different things. For those who are experts, you can easily recognize HTML annotation here. But in principle, that's a very strange mixture, and you cannot recognize the Russian text here. In fact, that's a very simple Russian sentence. Ты меня ничем не испугал. I'm not afraid of anything. And with a subject in you in nominative, object me in accusative, ничто, nothing in instrumental case, negative particle, and the verb in the past tense and perfective aspect. That's very simple basic sentence. All this is provided in the annotation. Part of speech, grammatical categories, all these are within these tags, you see. For example, that's nominative case of the, that's past tense of испугал, and that's the idea that меня is a form of я, the dictionary entry, lemma is with a is ya. So all these information and many other types of information is within this annotation, and it allows us to make a search. I can look for all past forms, for all perfective forms, for all accusative forms, and so on, because it is already annotated within this corpus. So that's important. And another useful term, national corpus, which goes back to British national corpus. It is national in the rather technical sense that it represents British variant of English. But since that time, usually corpus linguists use the term national corpus as a special, as the main corpus which represents the language, which is first representative. It means that it is a considerable size and includes different text types. Ideally, everything which is written, which exists in a language, must be included in a national corpus. That's ideally, of course. That's not always the case, but since different. And not only many different texts, but the corpus must be balanced. It means that the rate of different texts must be somehow checked and observed. For example, we cannot include in a corpus only fiction or only law text, and so in this case it will be unbalanced. So that's rather complicated things. There is a large discussion within corpus linguistics how to achieve balance. I won't elaborate on it, but representative and balanced are two main features of what we would like to call national corpus. So when we have a big corpus, a national corpus of a language, we can have large and representative samples of data concerning almost only interesting phenomena for study languages. And more than that, because large samples in principle can be obtained differently, manually. For example, that's very long, maybe months or years may require, and in a corpus we can obtain the same simple example in less than a minute, several seconds. But in principle, we can do it without corpus. But there are things which we cannot do without a corpus. And one of them, for example, is this dynamics observation about what I can call microdiachrony of a language, because a language changes constantly, and this very small change cannot be readily observable without corpus. For example, for Russian there are 18th, 19th and 20th centuries text, and we can see how Russian language changed through these 3 centuries, and the corpus allows us to do this type of research, among others. And of course, a very important part of implementing corpora or applying that's language teaching. That's a very powerful tool for teaching as native language and as non-native languages. So for those who teach Russian to foreign students, corpus is also very useful too. Okay, so we can say usually that the appearance of corpora is that's a technical revolution comparable, for example, with the invention of a microscope, telescope, because our possibilities to look at language are increased dramatically. And quantitative studies, statistics, correlation, coevolution, and many, many other things which we can observe as corpus and which are constantly developed are allowed. And more important, from a theoretical point of view, it means that the object is text. So what we study, what is corpus, that's what linguists usually call text. And theoretically, that's not that straightforward, because you remember Saussurean paradigm about langue et parole. Saussure tells us that what we observe is secondary, and the main goal of a theoretical linguist is just a system, an underlying system which is called langue. It is behind text, so we must go through the text to this linguistic system. Text is, in a sense, less important for a theoretical linguist. But text is what we really observe, what exists, and language, linguistic system, is an artificial construction. So that's a very interesting bias that in 20th century, linguistic theorists didn't want to study real things very much. They wanted to study artificial constructed thing, and the same bias we can observe in generative linguistics, which is anti-structuralist ideologically, but in this respect they are in fact very close, because competence and performance by Chomsky is more or less the same thing. We must study competence, which is somehow hidden in our mind, and what we observe, that's just the epiphenomenal performance, and this is the same. And corpus, with corpus linguistic, text is in a sense back home. We can really work with text, and we can see how it is really constructed, and we see that, in fact, there are many things not accounted for by these 20th century structuralist and formal theories. So it contributes largely to the change of paradigms to a new linguistic model. Among that is a usage-based model I already mentioned. So you see here, as I told, that corpus linguistics and theoretical linguistics go hand in hand in slightly or maybe even dramatically changing theoretical views on what a linguist must study, and be the main focus of theoretical linguistics. Well, that's very important in my opinion. So now I go to some more technical. Well, of course, corpus and language teaching, as I can repeat once more, is a very thing, given easy access to a wide range of sources, for example, exercises, not only classic, also modern fiction. That's important because we know that our textbook usually, modern Russian literature, for example, is poorly represented in teaching materials, and corpus can remedied this bias, and of course lexical peculiarities, grammatical variation, semantics of grammatical force, all this, which is all very important for language teaching, can be readily available from the corpus if we can use. Well, that was a kind of theoretical forward, and now I would like to say a few words about Russian national corpus, about the corpus which we have created and know better than many other corpora. And it started relatively late because it had both negative and positive impact, because we could take into account the experience of existing corpora. Czech national corpus, first of all, which was the best Slavic corpora. And in 2004, it was opened as a free internet resource. That's whose corpora the link. And interestingly, this is one of the first corpora designed by linguists and for linguists. And that's a very user-friendly corpus, because early corpora were made by applied linguists, by programmers. They didn't care very much about normal linguists, because you had to know many special technical things in order to use these early corpora. So our corpus is different in this respect, it seemed. And so actually there are about 500,000 tokens, and this is developing, so increasing, constantly increasing, and chronologically it covers first of all the span of 300 years of modern Russian supplemented by old and middle Russian corpora, because the early documents representing what we can call a Russian language go back to 11th century. And so the idea is to have a continuing covering of all the attested history of Russian language within one and the same corpus, or a family of corpora, if you will. And there are many different types of publication. So, and it was a gradual process. Of course, we started discussing it as early as in 2001. There were preparatory stage, Russian Academy of Sciences was interested in this project, and we collaborated with a company Yandex, that's Russian Google, a very powerful search engine provided by a specialist at Yandex, and so in April 2004, as I told, it was opened, and then it is constantly developed, and will be developed in the future. So how the Russian National Corpus now, that's a rather complicated family of different corpora, but first of all there is so-called main corpus, основной corpus as it is called, and there are morphologically annotated text and written and spoken standard Russian. First, late modern Russian, a very important part, contemporary text from the second half of 20th century, about 140 million, as you can see. And there is special modern newspapers corpus, very large, and it is given as a separate corpus. You can search in it. And the corpus of oral text for the same period, recorded oral texts and annotated. And early modern Russian, the written text, of course, because we don't have oral text of that period from 18th century up to the first half of the 20th century. You see that the size is roughly the same. Late modern Russian is somewhat bigger, which is natural, but in principle that's more or less balanced. And there is a special corpus of Russian poetry. That's a very interesting project, almost unique. There is also a corpus of Czech poetry within Czech National Corpus. That's the only type of corpus course, I'm aware of, and Kirill will tell you in more details about it. And that's a very interesting project. And outside this main corpus, there are some minor subcorpora. It doesn't mean that they are all very small. They are minor in a maybe metaphorical sense, but still there is a very important project, a parallel corpus project. Yesterday we talked about this, where a Russian text and their translation and vice versa, translation into Russian and they're leveled, and you can search for translation equivalence, an extremely useful tool which will be developed. We will care very much about this project. The biggest part is of course English-Russian. That's natural, and also German-Russian is now rather well representative. That's Dmitry Dobrovolsky, a well-known specialist in German, is responsible for this project. And then are somewhat smaller but still very important three corpora, so three Slavic languages: Ukrainian, Belarusian and Polish. And most important, most close to Russian, and Polish-Russian was made in collaboration with our Polish colleagues representing Polish National Corpus. And Ukrainian, so far as I'm concerned, that's the biggest Ukrainian corpus at the internet. So in principle, if you want to study Ukrainian independent of Russian, you would be advised to use this parallel corpus within the Russian National Corpus because it's biggest and well annotated. And some smaller parallel corpora, that's starting projects, but they may be Italian, Bulgarian and French, much smaller, but we hope that they will be developed. Armenian corpus, also based on Eastern Armenian National Corpus, just translation. And even smaller experimental corpora, but still they have a potential for development. Latvian, Estonian, Buryat, and that's a language from Mongolian branch. And we have small, and Spanish. Spanish is very small because we have just started it, but of course it can increase in number easily. But as of March this year, it is like this. So in principle, we are ready to increase the number of languages, the size, and again, I repeat it again, parallel corpora are a very important project within Russian National Corpus. Okay, so there is, within parallel corpus, there is also a so-called multilingual corpus, because parallel corpus consists of a text and its translation, and the multilingual corpus consists of one text translated in many languages. There are some well-known texts, famous texts. One of them is Bible, of course, the first multilingual corpus is. But we took some modern text, following here Adrian Barentsen and Ruprecht van Waldenfels. You are aware of this project, and some of the texts they gave us some of their texts. So what there is Le Petit Prince here of Saint-Exupéry, translated in many European languages. There is Winnie the Pooh, translated in many European languages. There is Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, and Da Vinci's Code, if I'm not mistaken. So, four most popular texts, which can about 20 languages, including Latin, Hungarian, and Slovenian are there, because I think that Da Vinci's Code was translated, and some others, so you may find some portions of Slovenian here in our multilingual corpus. Okay, that's not the whole story. We have also a small corpus of dialect text. a small syntactically annotated corpus, because usually syntactic annotation is not provided. That's a very complicated story technically. We have a rich morphological annotation. Russian is a language, is a free word order and a rich inflectional morphology, and in principle the absence of syntactic annotation can be compensated by rich morphological annotation, but still a small part is that's dependency annotation, more like in Czech treatment. And the small learner's corpus, they are texts from school program, from school books, Russian classics, that's for school teachers, so that's also in a sense a secondary project, but school teachers use it. So reversing to the main corpus, there are both written and oral text, all types of written text, including fiction, poetry, memoirs, newspaper accounts in use, advertisement, and so on and so forth. So that's we did care about balance, and fiction occupies not less than 40%, if I'm not mistaken. That's important for Russian culture, for studying Russian language. The high proportion of fiction is important, and there are also spontaneous oral text, public performances, movie transcripts. That's very interesting, easy to take. And that's and the annotation is very good. And there are several major types of annotation: corpus, metatextual, morphological, central, semantic, and poetic annotation, metrics, graphics, and so on. I will elaborate on it. So metatextual annotation, that's important. That's the features of the text itself. The author, title, the date. The date is very important because for historical studies, like chronic. And for fiction, we provide also genre, time, place, described for non-fiction. Text type, about what it is about. So, for example, you can, all these parameters are searchable, of course, that's why they are provided. And I don't know, you can, for example, you can look for you use a subcorpus. For example, all the text written by women of specific age, specific generation about sports. I don't know, that's a rather strange example, but in principle it can give you the idea of how it can be structured and used for search. Oh, by the way, if you study gender parameter, that's not that stupid, because the sex of the author is provided, and you can study possible differences between this type of text and so on. So logically, that's a problem. Usually the main part it is made automatically by a special program without disambiguation. You know that the rate of homonymy is rather high in Russian, as well as in other Slavic languages, and there is a small part manually disambiguated. Both are useful, automatically annotated and disambiguated, so we use both for different purposes, but both exist within Russian corpus, and of course there is morphological information of all types, not only part of speech as in many other corpora, but also inflectional categories and non-standard forms, which somehow derived. And that's a frequent case because the corpus gives us not normal text, but real text, which can rest from what we should call norm. So semantic annotation is based on lexicon, and there are specific set of values for different lexical class. So verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and so on have different semantic tags. And usually there is a taxonomic parameter, for example, verbs of motion, adjectives of color, and so on. So you can find the names of all musical instruments, of all nationalities, if you will. That's rather useful. And melody, parts and wholes, that's also useful for some types of study. And of course some derivational feature. We don't have a consistent derivational notation, it is still in progress, but already now you can search for many useful like diminutive, semi-affectives within the verb and so on. It is possible. It is possible. And here what is important, what I already said, that corpus annotation, corpora in general, must take into account the fact that the text we work with are very far from what can be construed as a normal, as a standard text, because corpus gives you a real picture of Russian and any other language as it is, with many mistakes from the point of view of normative grammar, but we have to take them into account. So our morphological annotation is much more flexible as compared to what you can find in academic grammar, for example, in textbook, and that's very important, both theoretically and practically. So corpus represents a real use, and that's why it is valuable. So very different types of texts. On the one hand, the modern fiction, you can imagine that modern fiction is very far from the idea that violation of the norm, that's the main thing the modern fiction does, and we have to. On the other hand, we have spontaneous electronic communication, and where people write in a way very far from what school norm prescribes. So, and all this is included in the corpus. A special learning corpus is available as well, as I've told you, but the bulk, the majority of the text is very far from norm, and that's very important. Okay, so just I would like to highlight some recent development. So semantic annotation, magic annotation for poetry, the corpus of regional newspapers, a very recent development. So we not only within Russian Federation, also Russian language newspapers from Baltic states, from the USA, from different countries, and which give us a very interesting examples of changing norm outside Russia, because the Russian language exists now outside Russia, and that's very interesting, and we have to observe, to take into account this. So regional newspaper corpus can provide data for this. So 18th century text, a very interesting period, very difficult for annotation, but we did it. And Old Russian and Church Slavonic, the language which is used by Russian Orthodox Church up to now. And we have a corpus of old Church Slavonic, not old Church Slavonic, modern Church Slavonic text. That's important also because modern Russian is a mixture of Church Slavonic and modern Russian, as everybody knows. So we also have this, and multimedial corpus, where you can not only read but see people talking with each other. That's mostly movie transcription, and some visualization and graphics, which are an important part of each corpus. Well, and now I would like to show you on the internet just online examples of how you can search corpus. I have some time, but just to conclude this introductory part, I would like to give you a very small but very nice example, in my opinion, how corpus can serve as a powerful tool for obtaining something really new about a language. That's a very small example from our colleague Nina Dobrushina, who is part of this Corpus team, and that's an article published about Russian numerals dva and dvoje. So those who know Russian know that Russian numerals have dva, that's standard, but there is also dvoje, a form which is called collective in standard grammar, and standard grammar will tell you that dvoje is used when for human masculine, so you can say две девочки, two girls, but двое мальчиков, two boys, that's a special form. Typically Russian, something like this exists in Polish, but in principle that's an East Slavic development. So that's standard. No, very
exists in Slovene also.
Yeah.
It exists in Slovenia.
Yeah, but in a different way.
In a different way.
But if I'm not mistaken, the distribution is different. That's in principle historical. That's a very interesting type of numerals, but that's another story. So, what standard Russian grammars tell us is relatively simple. Human, masculine, but if we look in the corpus, the picture is not that straightforward, much more difficult. First of all, it is not included in this table, but you can find feminine names. For example, dvoje dочерей, which is absolutely impossible from the point of view of normative grammar, is very frequent. And well, I personally, if I hear dvoje dочерей, well, for me that's maybe normal. Maybe slightly colloquial, but that's possible. That's from the one hand. From the other hand, maybe even more interesting. Many names which would have this form are never attested. For example, let's enter angel, never attested with dvoje angelov, which theoretically is perfectly possible, are never attested in 500,000 corpus, no a single occurrence. So you see the difference between the logic of corpus linguistics and the normative grammar, this between competence and performance-oriented linguistics. Theoretically it is possible, but it is not attested in a corpus, and that's very important for us. Captain, kapitan, is attested, but only 3%. Dva kapitana is much more frequent than dvoje kapitanov. Several examples are tested. Vrach, a doctor, slightly more, but still dva vracha are much more preferred as compared to dvoje vrachei. Dvoje vrachei are still not that unfrequent, but dva vracha are largely dominant. But подросток, teenager, these are also relative equality, but два подростка are still more frequent, and only words like боевик, give us a rather considerable number of dvoje. Dvoje боевиков is more frequent than dva боевича. So that's only a fragment. Abrushina gives a much more detailed table, and these are very interesting data. So in fact, we have to modify standard rule, and in fact, modification is not very it's natural. We can roughly the rule that those human beings which typically occur in groups privilege dvoje, and those, that's a cognitive-based rule related to how our world is organized, and those human beings of usual nature which do not normally occur in groups are reluctant for use dvoje. For example, another example I can give, dvoje президентов is impossible. A president it's only one. Dvoje президентов sounds it's absurd. a group of presidents which functions. So the idea of functioning together of course, rebels usually function together, and teenagers also form groups. That's typical, but not angels, not presidents, and not captains, of course, only one captain, and much less doctors. Of course, we may have a considerable of doctors, but Doktorov seems strange for this respect because that's something individual. So very interesting group, very natural in a sense, but totally absent from traditional grammars. And so that's what the corpus allows us to do, and there are many, many hundreds of facts like this. So if we speak about a corpus-based grammar, so this grammar must account facts like this. So just to conclude briefly, so modern linguistic corpora include everything a linguist may want to ask about a language, so about a real linguistic use. And our team, principal, some other colleagues in Moscow, have created just for information, for your information, several other corpus beyond the Russian National Corpus. They are ANC-based parallel corpora using slightly different search engines here. So one of them is Eastern Armenian National Corpus, a very interesting project. So you can see the internet address. You can, and that's the biggest corpus. And there is a family of smaller corpora, which are all found on this portal Web Corpora.net, and there are corpora of languages of Russian Federation and some other. So modern Yiddish, Ossetic, Lesbian, Kalmuk, Tatar, Gmuk, Albanian, relatively large, and modern Greek corpus, and several others. So you can see. So they are more or less similar. This search engine implemented for Eastern Armenian National Corpus. So, and again, there are many relations between usage-based linguistic model. We focus on descriptive attitude, not prescriptive, from binary to gradual grammaticality judgment, and not just black and white, but different degrees. And variation is very much privilege, and quantitative approach, of course, is so that's briefly I recapitulate these important proper features of corpus-based approaches. And what is the most frequent is to be the most privileged in a linguistic description. This claim may seem trivial. Of course, we have to privilege what is the most frequent, but it is not that trivial. And I recall that in 20th century linguistic theories, the opposite view dominated. Again, if we think about competence and performance problem, for example, a quote, early quote by Postel, but which is still shared by many theoreticians, which claims just the opposite. The most frequent is not that interesting for a theoretician because we have to study performance, competence, and you see the definite judgments available to English speakers about such cases, rare cases, Postel means, must follow from general principles that are internalizable independently from such marginal sentence. So the more marginal the sentence is, the more interesting to linguistic theory. So here we see just two very opposite views on what is to be studied first. So usage-based theories and corpus linguistics thinks that the most frequent phenomena must be primarily studied, and here that's the opposite view, an artificial construction, just to test this internal hidden systems. So that's not that trivial. But well, let us see both approaches widely presented. But the ultimate goal is to have corpus-based documentation of ideally all the world's languages and corpus-based grammatical descriptions, and we are rather far from that goal, but maybe this century's linguistics will proceed in this direction. And so I recall two important classes. So that's a Russian national corpus again, and please mind this one, that's would be a Russian corpus-based grammar. That's our new project. Within Institute for Russian Language, we proceed very slowly, and what this year will publish the first series of it, which are called Materials for Russian Corpus-Based Grammar. Not grammar, but just some materials. Because that's a very large task, but in principle we think about new grammar of Russian, which would be corpus-based and which would account for all these. So you can look on this side. There is some fragments of description already available, and this is developing. Okay, so I think that already that's what I wanted to tell, and I could just show you Russian national corpus, and I'm ready to answer your questions, of course. Just a minute. Yes, here how it looks. That's the main page. We have an English interface, but it is advised to use a Russian interface using Russian national corpus, which is maybe more natural. So, for example, the search in the corpus. This is the main page. So you can specify the subcorpus, morphology. That's the lemma, grammatical features, semantic features, and you can search many words with distance, including distance, and so on. Maybe a multi. See, it's parallel corpus, and we could, on this, for example, multilingual corpus. I don't know, some very simple example, dog, example, house, yeah. Usually it must be quick, very quick, because here internet is slow.
Okay.
Normally in Russia is several seconds. Okay, but let us do it, the possibility. I could answer your questions in the meantime.
Yeah. First, Уважаемый Владимир Александрович, большое спасибо за этот прекрасный, интересный доклад. И теперь, пожалуйста, вопросы на английском, на русском, на славянском. На славянском мы будем переводить. То есть есть
на любом другом языке, который входит в параллельный курс.
Можно, да. Наверное, так долго, потому что там это Россия далеко.
Нет, у меня здесь приведены примеры из Dan Brown, Da Vinci Code.
Well, I don't know.
Славянские примеры получаются, да, тоже?
Да. That's what I wanted to show, just that Slovenian. Yes. Finally. Yes, you see the first is Dan Brown, that's true. That's how it looks in general. So you see that's the title of the text, the total number of examples, so there are 53 occurrences of dom in Da Vinci Code. And this English, you see, that's Dutch. That's Russian. In Russian the word is highlighted because we looked for Russian lemma, so it is highlighted, and we have to find the counterparts this because it's a sentence by sentence. So this is the sentence where the equivalent of dom is expected to occur. So the user must find it somehow. 3000 mil od doma. 1,000 miles from home. So you see, not house, but home in this case. And so Russian, Ukrainian, 3000 mil від дому. Polish, and that's Slovenian, right? Yes, Croatian. Doma. Yes, you can have an expanded context, for example, if you need, that's enlarged. And so on, so we have annotation, and the annotation is provided, so that's English, that's useful. Of course, for Russian, the annotation is more detailed, for example, nabiti. That's either adjectives or participle from nabit, passive participle, and so on. And in principle, you may have a link to dictionaries. You can look in Russian explanatory dictionaries what is nabits, and there is a much like in your Flam portal. And so on. So there are many possibilities for looking at corpus. Maybe if you have some specific questions, I could show you. Okay. So you see that it works. Yeah.
А яке вprašanje? Kakšna diskusija? У меня, то есть даже не вопрос. Мне очень неприятно, но я должна возразить вам.
Ага.
По поводу этих примеров двое боевиков, два ангела. Это я нашла такое объяснение уже в грамматиках корпусных. Это было, я не помню в какой, но, наверное, в грамматике для иностранцев. И там было немножко по-другому объяснено, что это зависит от иерархического положения, что сводится как ваше объяснение лучше.
Лучше.
Да.
Не мое, а наброшенное.
Да. Но там было, например, что там было солдат и генерал. Значит, надо два генерала, но можно двое солдат. То есть просто
Стилистического, наверное.
Это очень
высокое слово.
Я думаю, что Добрушина более права. Здесь важна способность функционировать в группах.
Да, это гораздо...
Иерархия – это частный случай.
Да.
Потому что, скажем, врач плохо объясняется этим.
Да.
Но это интересный факт, это не случайно, потому что преподаватели русского языка как иностранного часто знают гораздо больше теоретиков.
Да.
И это совершенно верно. В этом подходе много общего с корпусной лингвистикой и вот и с usage-based, потому что это люди, которые думают о реальном использовании языка. И хорошо известный факт, что есть довольно большое расстояние между академической грамматикой и практической грамматикой для иностранцев. И вот как раз корпус тоже может преодолеть это расстояние, потому что преподаватели очень много пользуются корпусом. Вот, так что это совершенно не случайно. Преподаватели много знают про русский язык, то, чего не знают академические русисты. Вот, так что они... Потому что если мы учим иностранца, ну, двое генералов – это ошибка, не говорят. Поэтому хороший преподаватель должен вот про это задуматься.
На словенском языке формулация «двое» у нее эротический элемент. Тоже в русском языке, наверное. А не лес. Сесерече, гриволочка. Є мальця, є субстантивировано.
Нет, это в целом интересная история этих собирательных. В польском они употребляются тоже, но не так, как в русском.
А может быть, это не столько вопрос стилистический, но нарратологический? Разные сюжеты, разные...
Ну, почему не сказать, что это семантика?
Да.
Просто языковая семантика вообще так устроена. Язык отражает жизнь. Вот.
И опять еще вопрос. Как относятся люди в России, которые очень, то есть охраняют нормы литературного языка? Потому что у нас в Словении мы иногда чувствуем, что все-таки нормы литературного языка мы должны сохранять. И есть какое-то ощущение страха, что теперь, если корпус покажет, что типичные ошибки очень частые, что люди подумают, а может быть они правы.
Да, такая проблема есть. Это, я думаю, общая проблема. И здесь, ну, специалисты по языку, в общем, обычно понимают друг друга. А вот взаимодействие, так сказать, с обществом, это сложная проблема. Потому что в массовом сознании, конечно, есть идея, что существует правильный язык, который портится непрерывно, и лингвисты должны его защитить. И когда мы объясняем, что мы ничего не защищаем, а наоборот мы изучаем все виды языка, то, конечно, многие люди реагируют на это отрицательно. Но, на мой взгляд, это скорее проблема взаимоотношения ученых и общества. Важная проблема, в принципе, а не внутри лингвистическая проблема. Ну, лингвисты хорошо понимают, что норма, в общем, это во многом искусственная вещь, она меняется, и, конечно, изучая язык, мы должны изучать его вот во всем многообразии. Вот. Но поскольку я работаю вот в Институте русского языка сам, я очень хорошо это знаю, потому что на институт все время, так сказать, разные люди приходят, спрашивают, это, так сказать, то, что постоянно обсуждается, ну, надо это иметь в виду. Но, конечно, нам часто говорили, зачем вы включаете в корпус неправильные тексты. Зачем? Но вот для этого у нас есть обучающий корпус. Там Тургенев, Чехов, Булгаков, там хороший русский язык. Ну, мы говорим для науки, мы включаем для науки. Ведь биологи изучают не только оленей благородных, но и тараканов тоже. Вот. Никто не говорит биологу, зачем вы изучаете тараканов. Я обычно так отвечаю.
Я не имею в виду того, что не надо изучать. Конечно, надо. Но чтобы поняли, что все-таки нормы это отдельно. То есть это в школах изучают. А лингвист, конечно, все.
Но норма меняется.
Да.
Ну вот недавно была известная проблема, весь интернет ее обсуждал, что Институт русского языка выпустил словарь, в котором слово «кофе» помечалось как среднего рода «возможно». То есть вариативность. поднялась буя в интернете. Институт русского языка портит русский язык. Кто дал право этим ученым? Значит, средний род слова кофе, корпус, это прекрасно показывает, существует с XVIII века. Непрерывно. Он исчезает только в текстах советского периода. Потому что цензура строгая, редакторская, но эмигранты в это же время, у Набокова средний род кофе, например. Теплое кофе – это совершенно нормальное сочетание и в первой половине 20 века, и в 19-м. Вот. Поэтому ну вот, мы просто узаконили реальный узус. Вот. Но вот даже такие мелочи очень плохо воспринимаются обычными людьми. Так что есть такая проблема. Есть.
Есть еще вопросы?
Maybe I can have a question about with this multilingual parallel corpus. How did you do the annotation for this?
For other languages than Russian?
Yes.
Yes, normally they were provided by our colleagues. For example, when in Polish, Russian parallel corpus, Polish annotation were made by Lazinski's team, and they go as is. For some languages, we had to develop the annotation, which were not annotated. In principle, that's not that difficult. It is only time-consuming to have automatic morphology. That's the whole science about it. But if we can have a ready annotation, we use it. If we cannot, we try to develop. For example, if it's Polish here, English, Polish, chance. Yes, you see, that's not maybe not like we would do it. We just translate it into Russian, the text. But in principle, that's plural genitive, the chance. That's correct. That's correct. So, but that's not made by us.
And do you think it would be a good idea maybe in future to have a sort of universal?
Very good idea.
I know it's
yes,
extremely
but
demanding task,
we are very far from it. In principle, I think that any collaboration in the domain of Slavic corpus linguistics is highly desirable, because early 19th and the beginning of 21st century was a period when different Slavic countries tried to develop different corpora based on different devices, technical solutions. Maybe now that's time to talk to each other and to try to somehow to make closer. It would be very, very useful, very wise. And Slavic corpus linguists sometimes think about it, and for example, Marko Tadic, also one of the contributors of Croatian National Corpus, also is a great enthusiast of some Slavic. So I think we should think. For example, the next Congress of Slavists could provide a room, a space for such a discussion. We could think about, I don't know, a round table on Slavic corpus linguistics.
Parallel. Slavic corpus.
The same type of annotation, if I understand well. The same system of annotation.
Not maybe
Not
the same, but similar.
yeah.
Similar. I would welcome this very much. I think that's time. Just almost all Slavic languages, at least major Slavic languages, do have their own corpora. Some of them are very good, and so I mean that's time to make some further steps in this direction.
So še vprašanje? začrtena, ker drugače ja еще раз благодарю вас, Vladimir Aleksandrovič, za прекрасный доклад и объявляю перерыв.
15 minut na pauza.